We get the mics first, hot first. J-Dubs, please. Okay. All right, guys, we're going to rock and roll on the Friday edition of Real Talk with Keith Smith. The mics are going hot right now. The show technically has not started. Jay Dominic is in the house. This man needs no introduction. I think it's his fourth or fifth rodeo here on the I Love CVille set and on Real Talk with Keith Smith. Keith Smith has brought a gentleman in the attorney business, the Esquire business, a closing attorney, to the show as well. Give us a tease before the program starts, Keith, of what you got planned for today.
Yeah, so to my right is John Ralston, an attorney at law, specializes in a bunch of things, but we're going to talk a little bit about real estate. Since the decoupling has happened, we're about a month into it, I've been getting a lot of questions from real estate agents on how to handle certain circumstances. So I felt it'd be really good to put a round table of some pros together. And tackle. We're going to kick it off with one question that I've been asked a lot and see where the feed goes from there. But send us your questions and we'll take it from there. Then we're going to ask Woody Fincham, appraiser extraordinaire, to join us. And he will go ahead and look at things from his perspective.
Viewers and listeners, give the show a like and a share, live on all social media platforms. We're going to have a lot of fun today on the Friday edition of Real Talk with Keith Smith. We miss this man tremendously. Judah Wickhauer, we can rock and roll when you're ready, my friend. Good Friday morning, guys. My name is Jerry Miller. Thank you kindly for joining us on Real Talk with Keith Smith. It's great to connect with you guys through the I Love CVille network on a show that is presented by the who's who of real estate in Charlottesville, Albemarle County, and Central Virginia. You see the businesses on screen. You see them on the Partners tab on Real Talk with Keith Smith. These are the trusted advisors that Keith and his nearly 40 years of being in the real estate business is personally vetted and suggests you, the public, utilize on your path to closing. If you have questions today, put them in the feed. We will relay them live on air to a panel of experts. The program live all over your phone and wherever you get your podcasting and social media content. Judah Wickhauer, if we can go to the studio camera, and then if we can go to a four-shot as we welcome our panel of virtuosos and experts extraordinaire. Keith Smith, good Friday morning.
So I was just thinking 40 years that there's a new thing. I'm wearing a gray suit. Supposedly the gray hair and the gray suit blends in, according to my sister, who's the interior decorator. Just saying.
I think it looks great, Keith Smith.
There you go.
You got in the game in 87, technically 37 years. Yeah. I'm aging you a bit, but nearly 40 years has a nice ring to it.
Well, when you reach a certain age, aging people a bit is probably not a good thing. Let's go the opposite direction. I'm excited about today. You know, we've got a little bit of a roundtable discussion here. We're going to kind of chat a little bit about some questions that I've received in reference to, let's call it the decoupling of commissions from the MLS, and you know, what are these gentlemen seeing in their world, and then ask some questions for the feed. But before we do that, why don't we give John an opportunity to introduce him real quick. John, give us the quick flip book of who you are, where you're from, and whatever you want to do without getting ourselves too much in legal trouble.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. Well, I was born and raised in Charlottesville, so this is my hometown. Got admitted to the bar 2015, came back to Charlottesville, and just been playing along with real estate and raising my family.
So do you do things other than real estate, right?
I've done I'd say business incorporation, business purchases, landlord-tenant, wills and trusts.
You did a trust for a very difficult client, right?
Only the most difficult. Yeah, only the most difficult.
You just recently knocked a trust out for Yon and I, so thank you very much.
So you do commercial as far as leases go?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You do a lot of real estate closings?
Yes. Bread and butter, primarily just commercial, residential, every day.
Fantastic. Do you enjoy your job?
No comment, but yes, I do.
Talk to us about what a day-to-day looks like for you.
Increasingly, it's just on the phone, putting out fires, trying to figure out a way to get past an impasse, or if there's a title defect, just trying to research it, figure out if there's a way to kick it out, or I don't want to call it like an alternative, but just find some type of deal or agreement about how to handle something. So, I would say when it started, it was 80% technical, 20% on the phone, and now it's switched to really just 80% on the phone, talking about the technical
And
and
why
how
is
to bypass
that?
it.
Why is that, John?
Well, because I would say now it's really who's on the other side, knowing the parties, knowing the realtors, knowing the attorneys or the settlement agents, and being able to pick them up and say, look, I'm not going to try to sneak something past you. I guess best what I could say is there's some trust between the parties, and that helps. That eases a lot of tension because you can say, all right, well, attorney on the other side, I know them, we'll work it out. And we do.
Before we get into some questions, and Jay, I'd love you to jump in on this. Transactions seem to be becoming more difficult, right? Your 80-20 rule got reversed. How we met, and I'll leave the specifics out of it, but we met with helping a client that the daughter, let me get this straight, I apologize. The sister was divorcing the brother. This was a crazy deal.
The sister was married to the brother. That's super crazy.
Well, it's West Virginia. I'm sorry. But she was suing her brother to possession of the house. And that was I will tell you, of nearly 40 years of doing this, that was probably the most difficult transaction we did. And thank you for walking us through that. But Jay, are deals getting harder to do now?
I think some of the deals have gotten harder to do because people have been forced to stretch. When you're really trying to stretch the guidelines and stretch the qualifying and stuff like that, you don't leave much room for error. And the mortgage guidelines are really a minefield of little things that could trip you up at any time if you aren't careful and you don't know them. But there's always something that's outside the norm. But I find that if people were trying to really stretch the absolute limit of their qualifying, then you're asking for some trouble perhaps and some difficulty. Because if something doesn't happen, like I'm hourly pay and then I didn't have PTO, so I took a week off of work, that changes your income. And now maybe you don't qualify if you were walking that tightrope from a qualifying perspective.
At some point, I'm sure Jerry's going to ask you where interest rates are going, but maybe
I think everyone wants to know that. Everyone wants to know what the Fed's going to do in the September meeting. Everyone wants to know where rates are going to go after the election. I think we all find it a bit curious that we're going to have a rate cut right before the election, but this is not a politics show. Very curious to see if Q1, Q2, if the rates are going to get into the fives, all those questions. But before we do, I want to throw this to Jay. It's a very open-ended question. How do you characterize the market today? Balanced, healthy, seller one-sided, buyer one-sided. How do you characterize it?
I think it's coming into balance a little bit more. We're coming out of a really strong seller's market. But I'm starting to see where there are some price decreases. That may be partly due to people thinking the market is what it's not. Mm-hmm. So they're overestimating the value of their homes. But I think it's all going to come down to the way the inventory comes in. If the inventory increases, the rates come down. I think it's going to remain a slight seller's market for a while. Let me just throw that prediction out there. But it is getting a little more balanced. I have some people who are negotiating closing costs. They're negotiating. They're getting home inspections done, which for a while wasn't even something you could put into a contract. I've had properties go under contract that have a home sale contingency, which is something you wouldn't even dare try a year or two ago. So yes, I think it's working back into balance a little bit, but I think we've got a ways to go. It's going to be a slight seller's market for a little while just because of inventory.
Neil Williamson, the president of the Free Enterprise Forum, watching the program, TV station down the street, watching the program as we speak. John, I'm going to throw the same question to you as I give props to Jason Howard watching the program, Kevin Sullivan, good Friday morning to you, Alex Erpy, Gary Palmer, the broker watching the program, Lonnie Murray, Andre Xavier, Lisa Lawrence, Brittany Gray. You got the who's who of real estate watching the program. I'm seeing agents from Keller Williams, from Nest, from Real Estate 3, from Long and Foster, and investors like Trip Stewart, Seth Liskey, watching the program as we speak. Same question for you. How do you characterize the market today? How's your deal flow?
Well, it's a little skewed for me because during COVID, it was just volume, volume, volume. Well, now it may not be the same direct volume, but virtually every other deal feels complicated. So it's, whereas it was pure volume before, I'm just making it up in terms of getting complicated deals out the door. At least from my mind, it hasn't changed that much for me, but the client experience, I think it's a little stressed because it does seem like they have to fight to find the right home, or they've done multiple deals that have broken through, but it takes a little, I don't want to say work to get to the table, but they are working things out like closing costs, like Jay is. They're trying to be creative, and just what's left on the market for right now in terms of inventory.
So this is when the pros show up, right? This is this kind of market. When a little bit later in the show, when we could bring Woody on, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the market, because I believe certain micro markets that buyer needle is starting to go towards buyer, and we'll share some Altos research that I belong to kind of break down a couple of zip codes on what was going on there. But because I know you got to jump and you've got to do some closings. I do want to ask this one question, and I'm going to paraphrase because I've been asked a couple of different versions of this. So this is on this decoupling question, right? So for those who may be watching that may not up to speed on decoupling, what has happened now is the MLS precludes from putting in how much the buyer broker compensation is of anything. It's always been negotiable, right? We won't rehash the whole lawsuit at this point. But there was a couple specific questions, and it revolves around this one premise, that if I have a buyer broker agreement that say is 2%, which is making up numbers for the sake of a talk show, that is 2%, but the seller is paying 3%, there's a 1% differential. Let's say the contract has in it that it's a 3% buyer broker. What happens with that 1%? Am I, as a buyer broker, to me, it's coming to the buyer broker, can I give that 1% as a seller credit from the real estate, from the buyer broker, to help them pay closing costs? So in a $500,000 deal, it'd be $5,000 or whatever the math turns out. Can I do that legally? Can I do that from a loan perspective? If so, what does that look like? And how do I navigate that without any of us going to jail? I think since I mentioned jail, we'll start with the legal.
Of course. Everyone looked at me really quickly. Well, to start, there's no case law, there's no statute, there's no regulation I can think of that would stop or prohibit that. So to give the cop-out attorney answer, it depends. In my mind, where my
We
mind
say
goes.
maybe yes, maybe no yes.
No. I appreciate his position. Let him go here. I'm very curious of this.
Well, at least in my mind, where it goes to is transparency. Are the parties aware? Did they have the information on hand to make an informed decision? And by that, I mean really the seller. At least in my mind, the deciding factor is the seller, because the commission comes out of their proceeds. So if a buyer broker comes and says, look, I would like my 1% to go to the purchaser to help them with closing costs, also make sure they can afford this purchase, and they say yes, I don't see any issue with that, but the fact of the matter is, are they aware of that?
So it has to be in the contract.
Well, contract or there just has to be some way, whether it's a dialogue, contract, or otherwise. I mean, preferably contract, but I know with deals it can be fluid, but just at the end of the day, did seller know or have reason to know, and could they make an informed choice about it?
Because and there's historically been, and I'll get myself into trouble regularly here, John, so that you know this. I'm going to say this in advance. Historically, we in the real estate world have been told, well, you can't put this stuff in a contract, right? And I've never prescribed to that at all. I think the theory is there's three separate agreements, right? There's an agreement that I have with the buyer broker. There's an agreement Jay has with the listing, and then there's the contract. From my perspective, and I'm I stayed at a Holiday Inn or whatever it was. It's about the closest I got to anything legal. But the place to consolidate all that is in the contract. Am I looking at this right, or?
Well, I don't disagree. But granted, most of the time, I'm not the one who has to write the contract. By the time I get it,
you're
it's
the one
too
that's
late.
dealing with it, though.
Yeah, by the time I get the contract, it's too late. So that's why I kind of leave open to discussion, because I know that would come up. But whether it's in the contract or somewhere in writing, obviously, I put value to that.
But Jay, from your world, it's got to be in writing somewhere for that to happen, right?
It does have to be. If that 1% is out there floating around, it just can't appear all of a sudden as a cash credit or something like that. It has to be written somewhere so that we know where that's coming from. It has to appear on the closing disclosure. So what's going to be important with that is how it's written into the contract. So if you say, I'm getting 3%, but I'm giving 1% to my buyer to pay for their closing costs, that's allowed. Okay, it can be written that way. You're an interested party to the transaction from a lender standpoint. So there are limitations on how much interested parties can contribute: sellers, realtors, builders, whomever. But so if we take for instance, where somebody's, say they're putting a minimum down payment, 3% or 5% on a conventional loan, they're limited to 3% of the sale price in interested party contributions. If you are contributing 1%, that means that the seller can't pay another 3. That means the seller can only pay another 2. So that's where it makes the difference. If it's written as seller will pay buyer agent fee up to 1% or something like that.
But that has to be in other terms in our current contract, not in the concession portion of the contract, which is important.
Right. But as long as it's written, it's important to differentiate. The seller can pay the buyer agent fee. Okay.
So that's thank you for
We
saying
got comments coming in from people in the game. If you want me to relay their perspective,
just let me get this out real quick.
Yeah.
So that's a common misconception out there, that unless you tell me otherwise, almost every loan product allows this to happen. Correct?
Yes, they've always allowed that to happen. They've always allowed. They've allowed the seller to pay it. They've allowed the buyer to pay it, with the exception of VA. VA previously hadn't allowed.
But they changed that, right?
They changed that. They have a temporary variance in there. Okay, so it's not written in stone yet, but it's legit now. You can write a contract on it, but you can have the seller pay the buyer agent fee. The buyer can pay the buyer agent fee. Of course, if the buyer's paying it, then I need to know, because that could affect their qualifying.
So has to be in other terms, has to be spelled out from your perspective, however that language is, and speak to your broker if you're a real estate agent.
Mm-hmm.
They'll help you with that, but there has to be the language in it. You need it as a closing agent because it tells you how to disperse money, and then to include VA, this is allowable by all the lending
Yes.
mechanisms. Go ahead.
Michael Guthrie watching the program. We're going to get to Michael's comments here in a matter of moments. Andre Xavier, we're going to get to your comments as well. He says, Keith, you cannot take more than you negotiated on your exclusive right to represent agreement.
Thank you, Michael, for doing that, because that's my follow-up question to that. So thank you. We're going to jump into that in a minute.
He also says some folks say we will see a 5 in front of the interest rate before the end of 2024. Then he gives Jay Dominic some props on the program. And he says, in regards to the topic the panel's talking about, you would ask the seller to pay your 2% and then have the buyer in the contract ask for the other 1% for closing costs.
Well, to Michael's comment, this is the slippery slope, right? So the buyer-broker agreement, I can't get paid any more than what I've agreed to on that. So I'm not looking to get paid anymore. I'm looking for that money to be dispersed to my buyer as a concession to help them with closing. Otherwise, what happens with the 1%, Michael, right? It either, because if I have a listing agreement that's broken down this way, where does that extra 1% go? And look, I'll just say this publicly out there. The documents that VA realtors created, I think, made this more confusing than less confusing.
If I was the seller, I'd want to keep the 1%.
It depends on what your listing agreement says.
Well, if you're
Depends on what you're listing.
if you have a listing agreement with seller's representation, right? Wouldn't you caveat in that listing agreement, if the buyer broker has less than 3%, that stays with me? That's how I would do it.
Yeah, but
I mean, that
but
would be
may-
the easiest way.
I agree 100%,
Yeah.
100%. But what if it's not?
Then I would say the selling agent is not offering the best counsel to their client.
That
The
also
seller's
may be the
agent
case.
should be saying this counsel to their client.
But-
It's not always 3%. You need to hedge in case it's not 3.
So, John, from your, I get that, and you're a seasoned.
I mean, I have 24 doors, but that's what I would do.
Yeah, but the reality of it is some of these listing agreements may not have that in there.
Well, the listing agreement's a stock document that can be massaged.
I understand that. But from your perspective, what happens with that 1% if it doesn't have it outlined in the thing?
Well, my position is that, well, it's still the seller's money. That's one. Going back to what I said, I think it's kind of a decision for the seller. Like if they want to retain that 1%, they can do so. If they want to help the purchaser along, they can do so. I mean, within limits, obviously, but that's going back to, did they know about that choice or that distinction between the listing, what they agreed to on the listing versus the buyer-broker agreement? And that's why I think it's just really a question of transparency.
Right.
Could they make that choice, an informed choice?
Well said.
Because
And
it's their money at the end of the day.
the seller, before contract goes pending, can't the seller's representative on behalf of the seller ask the question, what is the commission in this deal for buyer broker?
Well, that's how this, if I understand the question correctly, that's how this is kind of moving forward, right? We're going to have a couple listings happen. We'll get phone calls. We'll share with what our seller is offering as a buyer broker. They're going to ultimately put this into the contract. And,
David Villa is watching the program. David, I believe you're in the game. I think he's in the game. He's a realtor. He says, I believe I don't have to share my buyer agreement with the seller. That's between me and my client.
I agree.
You agree with that?
100%. 100%.
So you don't think the seller has a right to say what's the commission that is being allocated to the representative that's looking at buying my house?
They can ask any question they want, but they are not party to that particular contract. That's the reason the statement I made earlier.
The seller's going to find out anyway.
The statement I made earlier is the contract of purchase is where these things come together.
Mike, Jay Dominic, you want to jump in on this? I see the wheels turning over there, Jay Dominic.
Well, I've had umpteen conversations about this, and I have my own opinions on it, stuff like that. But I think the key is going to be how that listing agreement is written.
Yeah.
So, and this doesn't affect me at all, except how it affects the borrower. But in my mind, I'm thinking, if I get a listing agreement and it says, okay, you agree to pay me as a listing agent 6%, for instance, and we will offer up to 3% towards a buyer broker to pay their fee. Then what happens when the 2% comes in I've got a buyer broker fee and it's only 2%? There's that 1% floating around there. In my mind,
And folks, this could be a lot of money. 1% on $1 million transaction. We're talking 10 grand here.
Right.
What's the median purchase price in the city of Charlottesville? The median house is over.
I'm going to give you.
What's the median over 5 bills now, right?
We'll talk about this a little bit later, but for up to the first 8 months of this year is 480. Is the
480 in Charlottesville.
median.
So we're talking.
No. That's the full car.
That's a full car. We're talking 5K here.
yeah, we're not talking about insignificant amounts of money.
Right.
But I'm thinking like, if I was listing a property as a listing agent, I might have that conversation with to say, hey, we're going to offer up to 3%. If somebody comes in with 2, then this will happen. And to your point, Jerry, then that should be spelled out
In the contract.
in your
listing
listing
agreement
agreement.
first.
The
So,
listing agreement,
I
and
want-
then if 2% comes in, if you don't spell that out, then in my mind, you've listed the house for 6% with agreement to pay up to 3% towards a buyer agent fee. If that 3% becomes 2%, there's nothing saying that now 4% doesn't go to the listing agent.
Because when we sold our house, we used the fabulous team of Keith and Yona Smith to sell our house in Glenmore. And when we sold our house,
All our documents were very
it was
clear.
very buttoned up.
Very clear.
It was very clear.
So,
Yeah.
so back to what John said, and John, we didn't have this conversation, and it's interesting because you teamed into it. I've been talking about the 6 things for a real estate.
John, welcome to Real Talk with Keith Smith right here.
And by the way, if you got something to say, just jump in and
Please,
say it.
sure.
Right.
Please.
And if you think Smith is full of you know what, you tell me.
And we got to get Woody in the mix, too.
We'll get Woody here in a minute, but
And comments are coming in fast.
so it's right location, price, features, condition, timing, and I've been saying this for a year, and it's like my kids, they don't want to hear me no more. Who's on the other side matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, it matters. But right now, this is when the pros show up. A credit to my wife, Yona Smith.
Love you, Yona.
When we were at the Reese Media CEO event last year, this time last year, I'm going to be there next week speaking again. She turned to me and said, you know who this is going to be hardest on? Listing agents. Not buyers. It's going to be listing agents. And she's right, because your listing agreement needs to be wired tight about what happens under these individuals. And again, if you're a real estate agent out there, don't listen to me. Talk to your broker. Your broker's the one that's going to guide you through this.
Beth Mark
through this
makes
process.
that point right there. God, comments are coming in fast here. Candace Vanderlyn of the fabulous Yes Realty Partners team. Biggest recommendation is for all realtors to know and understand what their brokerage is requiring and go to CAR and get the resources and answers you may not be getting elsewhere. All realtors should be aware of these practices, and there's a ton of education available. She also says that John Ralston guy, he's a rock star. Candace giving
Thank you.
John some props over here on the talk show.
I'll tell you, you
Thank you,
want
thank
a
you.
problem solved, call John.
This from Mr. Michael Guthrie. In a standard listing agreement, if the offer to the buyer is 3% and the agent can only get 2%, the listing agreement could keep the other 1% that does not go to the buyer's agent.
Correct, but I think that document needs a bunch of tightening up, and my hope is VR eventually is going to do that. But you know what we're counseling our folks is write out the scenarios in the listing agreement. If it should be if the contract amount is less than what the listing is, it goes back to the seller.
Andre Xavier's
Or
talking.
you're allowed to use it as
Right, that's what something you'd have to add in. But I agree with Michael. He was basically saying the same thing. Absent any kind of clarification on what that extra
It belongs to the
amount, it belongs to the listing agent. Is my
Yeah.
mind.
So-
Because
so-
I agreed to list the house and sell it for
So hold on, time out.
6%.
So now you're saying, if you don't change the language and edit that, I, as the listing broker, get paid an extra point instead of that.
That's the way
Yeah.
I view it. Now, like I say, I don't have to dabble in this. I just have to see how it ends up on paper for my borrowers. But I've heard a lot of talk about it. But if you list a house for 6%, okay, then you're saying I will list your house and pay a buyer agent
X.
whatever,
Yeah.
up to 3%. But if it becomes less, I still am getting 6%.
How do you feel? Oh, you
John's
wish,
shaking his head.
oh, you wish
well-
you never showed up.
No. I think he's enjoying
Slowly
this.
Is it time for
backing
me to
out.
leave yet?
I think he's enjoying this.
Well,
but
he and I have had a bunch of debates, so I
John's job is to hedge risk.
Yeah.
And that's what he's basically doing here with
Yeah.
his commentary. Is that not what you're doing here?
Yeah, but it's just in the course of a transaction. I mean, it just really depends on who you're working with. Because I know with your bank, you may want to see, okay, what happened to that commission, and we need to get that charted out in writing somewhere.
I think most
And-
banks would ask that.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one of two who may not catch it, but I guess in my mind, it's going to come down to conversation between the parties and being able to hash out. Because at the end of the day, if there's something you can't approve, the deal goes nowhere. Like if you're not comfortable lending on it because of how this commission is shown out or negotiated out, well, then the parties have to figure it out or they don't. So it's kind of like that's the lender, or at least your position. That's kind of where it, hits a brick wall. Either the parties work it out or they don't, or the loan's not going to go forward. So in that sense, it's just everyone's kind of going to be forced to talk about it, even if they don't want to.
This is why number 6 is who's part of this transaction.
John Ralston needs to come back to the show. Multiple people are saying John Ralston needs to come back to the show. I think you add good color to the show.
Oh, thank you.
The closing
Thank you.
attorney perspective.
So we're going to swap you out with Woody, but before you get up. Is there anything you want to add to this topic from your perspective?
Sounds like you can scoop up some business here too, John, if you want to scoop up some business.
And
It's blood.
You got a boatload of realtors watching you here.
any sage advice for anybody on my side of the fence doing business here?
Well, I mean, not trying to beat a dead horse, but at least from the attorney perspective or the settlement perspective, I find like 90% of the issues are just cleared if someone picks up the phone
Amen.
and just talks about it. And I think most, if not all, realtors, even settlement agents and banks want to see their client get the transaction. And 99% of the time, I find that's true. If people can just get on the phone, talk it out, it will more than often than not work itself out some way. You know, I would say the time that it blows up due to like just a difference of opinion or different attitude, it's very rare. It's not impossible, but I think most people, you know, keep their eye on the prize. And it's just...
But before you jump out, and Jay, chime in there, why is it so difficult for people to have a conversation? I don't understand that.
Because cell phones and social media have made conversations, actual conversations, work.
Yeah, that might be the answer.
Texting and social media has made talking work,
But I will,
which stinks.
I will tell you, in order to navigate where we are in real estate right now, you got to have a conversation with folks. You got to pick up the phone and say, Jay, blah 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 blah. You know, what can my client do? John, this is the brick wall that we hit. What's our solutions here and how we can communicate? And sometimes I find it best that for real estate agents, sometimes get the hell out of the way and let you guys, the two attorneys or the two closing agents, get in the middle of it, particularly if it's some areas that we don't have expertise in. But speaking of expertise,
Yep.
we're
Should
going to
have mixed
slide
some
in
instruction.
Woody. How'd you like that segue, huh?
That was very nice. John, you did a hell of a job, dude.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
John, thank
Well
you.
done.
You're welcome back anytime, my friend.
Well done. This is coming from Andre Xavier on rates.
Oh, boy.
This is actually, see you, John. You have a good one.
Thank you, John.
He said, I just had a friend lock in a 5.67% 30-year conventional, 10% down, 800 plus credit score.
That's it right
800 plus credit score. I was locked in yesterday, 5.67%. No points purchase.
So, Jay,
You see anything like that?
No.
Why-
That's,
That's a unicorn.
yeah.
Okay, what is the best you've seen so far?
Well, we were talking in a meeting yesterday where we're saying we should start reaching out to our veteran borrowers because they have the most streamlined refinance process. And we were talking about stuff in the 5 3/4 type of range for those types of refinances. So yeah, but if I can tell you this,
while you're doing that, why
ahead.
does credit score matter?
credit scores matter because that's what drives the bus for program eligibility, for interest rates, for mortgage insurance rates. That's a big one. I mean, that's where it matters. It can garner you some extra flexibility in the automated underwriting systems. So, if I'm looking to get a debt-to-income ratio of 49%, if my credit score is 620, that latitude might not be granted to you.
Yeah, the GSEs definitely look at credit now more than look at collateral on residential mortgages. Lyle Radke, who's basically the chief appraiser at Fannie Mae, often when he's speaking at conferences, reminds appraisers of that all the time. The appraisal is a part of the process, but they care more about that credit rating than they care about the collateral anymore.
So while Jay's looking up rates there, you were listening to this conversation. From your perspective, talk about appraisal with the decoupling. What are you seeing? What should we be doing as real estate pros to make your job a little bit easier to get through the process? So what are you seeing out there, and what best advice can you give? Best practice and best advice can you give?
We've only got a few minutes here. I guess the first place to start is that I sit on the car board, and because of this, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I'm not speaking on behalf of the car board. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand what I'm saying. But from an appraisal point of view, it's super important that the message and the education get out there to the agents, that they understand that concessions and commissions are two completely different things. We're seeing a lot of MLSs across the country that are conflating the things, and agents are wanting to report the buyer's compensation or the buyer broker's compensation to concessions, and they should not be reported that way. They're two different things. What's going to end up happening inadvertently if they do this is when an appraiser uses that as a future comparable sale in an appraisal report, they're going to end up having double dipped on cash equivalency because an appraiser has to adjust out cash equivalency when they're using a comp. What that means is that if they're paying 3% in concessions and then 3% in commissions, then the only thing that should really be adjusted for is that 3% of concessions. But if the agents are reporting them as commissions, some appraisers are going to end up taking that information and saying, okay, it's actually a 6% adjustment.
So where it ends up, when we were talking earlier, where it ends up in the contract is important, correct?
Absolutely.
So there's a provision in the new contract about concessions. Concessions need to be there, by the way. If you use the current form, you've got to scratch out a few things because it talks about MLS, but talk to your broker about that. But if the buyer's agent's compensation that the seller is offering has to be in other terms and or a separate document that's attached to it.
Yeah, it would be great if we could be transparent on that issue and have it listed out and itemized.
But if it's done that way, then only thing you're looking at is the concession, not the commission.
Yeah, so, and the other thing is a lot of the MLSs are taking the concession field out of the MLS. And the problem with that is that now we have to call all of the agents and get that information. And that makes a heavy burden on the agents and
But
a
if
heavy
it's in
burden
the
on the
contract
appraisers.
and you see the contract, it's there.
Well, the other appraisers that will use that in the future as a comparable sale don't have access to that. So it would be nice if there would be some way for the MLSs to come to some type of decision where they can continue to report the concessions. But a lot of them are saying, we're not going to do it because agents are going to report the commissions as concessions, and we don't want that tracked on the MLS anymore. It's a messy situation.
This is a mess.
I've read the settlement. That is never going to happen. That's not going to happen.
Your colleague in the appraisal game, I believe, is it John Kopulis?
Yeah, John Kopulis, yeah.
Yeah. He says, this is supposed to be done for the consumer, right? So now a great lister and a great buyer's agent can potentially get 7 or 8% between them. What's going on here?
I don't necessarily think that's the case, but under the scenario that we were talking about earlier, that if in the listing agreement it is not specified what would happen with any residual, right, then I think it's been agreed to. It goes to the listing agent if the language isn't changed in the contract. The transactions you and I have done was very clear where it went. It was all clear, but I mean, to add a little bit of flavor to that, I mean, it could conceivably, the listing agent, if done a certain way, could actually end up with a little more.
Right, and I think that's what he's pointing at.
Yeah.
Mr. Michael Guthrie, think of it this way. If the seller agrees to pay a listing broker a certain compensation and someone comes unrepresented, unless changed in writing, the listing agent is entitled to the entire compensation noted in the listing agreement.
Correct, except I'll push back a little bit, the new listing agreement does have an unrepresented portion of it, which speaks to that, how that process works. And some agents are charging more for unrepresented buyers because it's more work.
More work.
It's more work, sure.
It's more work. Jay, Dominic, the wheels are turning over there. Where you want to go? You were looking something up.
Well, I was just going to get some stuff with the discussion about interest rates. So, I track mortgage markets throughout the day, and the one site that I track does polling daily, and they've got the average interest rate at 6 3/8. Okay, which falls in line with the Freddie Mac.
So just under 6.5.
Right.
Okay.
So, and that falls in line with the.
What's your credit score got to be on that?
I'm sorry?
What's your credit score got to be on that?
That's an average.
Got it. So
Okay.
6 something.
Yes.
Something like that.
But the same thing goes for Freddie Mac, which has it close to 6 3/8 too. They publish an average
Got it.
interest rate. So that's really what people should be thinking of. I tell people all the time, it's like, look, I'm going to do a lot of work for you. If you want to find the absolute lowest rate in the world, then get on the internet and do it, and maybe it'll work out for you. But you're not going to get my representation. You're not going to get my name on a pre-approval letter.
Well,
and some places won't even take an internet pre-approval letter.
A lot of places.
We will very much so encourage our sellers to reconsider an offer if it's if it's from an internet provider, because to the point that,
Because they're giving pre-approval letters out like Halloween candy.
to John's point,
Oh, sure.
to John's point, right? Usually, where deals go sideways is on your side of the house, right? On your two sides of the house, right? Which is the appraisal.
I'm innocent. I didn't do
Most-
anything.
Woody Finch, I knew you were going to do
When he gets
that.
rolled into my side of the house,
Woody, come on, roll
the
me, buddy,
lender's
roll me,
appraiser.
buddy.
I know.
But it's usually the lending side, right? It's usually right. It usually falls apart somewhere at that point. It could fall apart at home inspection,
Sure.
and HOA, and a bunch of different other things that we bring, that work through a transaction. But generally, it's usually the banking side of it. So we're about a month in. What are you seeing on the appraisals? How are they going for you?
Things have stayed relatively the same. I mean, it hasn't made a big difference in our world. I've been on a couple webinars talking about, what we were just speaking about with the commissions and concession stuff, because, that's the big thing, is we're trying to get that education out there. Because that's the one thing that agent education doesn't do a good job of. They don't understand commissions and concessions. So I'm not going to stop. We'll stop beating that dead horse. But on the appraisal side, we're really not seeing a whole lot of change. We are calling agents more now to confirm things, so it's taking us a little longer in that process, because unfortunately agents don't see a lot of value in spending their time talking to appraisers. And it makes it very busy for us. But otherwise, we are moving into a more stable market in some of our market areas. That's the biggest change, but that has nothing to do with
So talk
the
about that for a
agreement.
second, because I want to get into that
Yeah.
in a little bit. I think some markets are shifting dangerously close to a buyer's market.
Yeah, I mean, when you get out into the fringe markets, especially, our main market being Charlottesville and Albemarle County, and then once you get out into the more rural areas, there are definitely some spots out there where we're starting to see more of a stable, the days on market's becoming longer. We're seeing price adjustments more often. I think the hyper listed super high price is probably going to be behind us sooner than later.
But we're not seeing prices decrease. I think we're seeing.
You're saying peak purchase price is behind us?
I think the
Is that what you said?
A lot of agents, and we do a lot of pre-listing work for agents, particularly on complex properties, that they have a hard time pricing. And they're not trying to price them to the moon anymore. They're trying to make it more realistic, because, we still have historically speaking, we have a relatively short days on market still. And the worst thing you can do with a piece of property right now is to price it in such a way that it's stale, because no one will. I mean, I've had situations where we're hired in after it's been on the market for 90 days, and they're trying to figure out what's going on, and it's priced too high. We're coming back and telling them that, the data just doesn't support where you're at, and the optimism's working against them because it's too strong of an optimism. It's okay to price high. You don't want to price it uber high, though, because then folks are just like, you know what, I'm not even going to bother with it.
So this is when pros show up. Pros matter, right? Pricing it right. Properties are increasing globally, are increasing in value at this double-digit scenario.
Appreciation's still occurring, for sure.
So that's important, right? So when you start seeing listings be price reduced, that means they probably didn't go in at the right price, right? For the location.
Generally speaking, yeah.
But we're not going back.
But that's always the case.
Well,
it's always the case.
Sellers, it's been my experience for the decades
Sellers
I've-
don't adapt to the market conditions
There you
as
go.
quickly as buyers.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
What-
So what are you seeing out there, Jay? Are you seeing up tempo, back tempo? What are you seeing from your world?
Well, like I say, I agree with Woody. Location. City of Charlottesville or Crozet is going to be different than somebody trying to buy a house, in Louisa or Buckingham. But I am seeing, like I say, some price reductions. I'm having clients still struggling to win deals, just because the prices are still high, and I've got some first-time home buyers that just aren't in that range yet, and some of the properties that, a first-time home buyer looking for a house for $250,000 is really struggling to find something.
That's a thing of the past now.
Yeah, and you have to go over in the valley or way farther south or something like that.
Yeah, but I've been saying this forever. Micro markets matter. Street to street matters. Block to block matters. Right. Home to home matters. But Judah, if you don't mind putting slide number 1. So I belong to Altos Research. That and NAR are like the two kings in the data business. But what this is the 22901 zip code. So basically 22901 and 22902 are split by 250. One goes west towards the mountain, one goes east. So if you take a look at that, so they have their own little matrix that they use from 0 to 100. 22901 is squarely in what they call a strong seller's market. But take a look at 22902. So that is east of 250. That's slide number 2, Judah. That's east of Long Street or 250. That kind of splits Charlottesville in half, working its way towards Lake Monticello and so forth and so on. That needle is dangerously close to a buyer's market. So those two zip codes, though they're in the Charlottesville, Albemarle area, are performing a little bit differently.
I'm really curious to see what's going to happen, and I want to highlight a couple of folks giving Woody Fincham some props. I'm very curious to see what happens after we get through this election and into the first quarter and second quarter of next year, where the expectation is that rates are going to drop even more. And as rates drop, buyers have more buying power because the whole process becomes more affordable. I'm curious to see what effect that has on the buyer-seller pendulum. Because I think you'll have more buyers than inventory available. Sandra Hard, giving Woody props. Lane Dupchin.
Just call him Lane.
Lane watching the program. Scott Harris watching the program.
So we can
David Massey.
We can now, because we made the commitment to join Altos, and we can track this on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, week-to-week, month-to-month, and we'll keep a track of that. But this buyer's market, and it's going to be very micro market located, is not going to be your parents, it's not going to be your grandparents, it's not going to be a buyer market, in my opinion, that we've ever seen before, because inventory, even though interest rates are going to drop, are going to stay flat.
Yes.
Inventory is going to stay flat.
Because it's going to be hard to give up that 2.5 or 3%, even at 5.5, if we get to 5.5 in Q2 next year.
And NAR, God love them, they're great at statistics, maybe not other things. Folks are staying, sorry, Woody, folks are staying in their homes for 10 plus years, right? So, and oh, by the way, it takes an act of Congress to get a development approved and built anywhere around here or in the country as a whole. So it's really weird. You're going to see inventory low, buyer pool remain high, but it's going to go to almost section by section and home by home and street by street. And if you're not adapting to the current price point of where the market is in that particular micro market, that home can turn into a buyer scenario instead of a seller scenario. What do you think, Woody? Am I all full of you know what?
No, in general, or
Yeah,
on this
it's
topic?
in general.
No, I don't disagree with what you're saying.
I love you too, Woody.
Feelings mutual, man. Feelings
Yeah,
mutual.
I love you.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I mean, when you're in the urban ring or the suburban ring, one street's difference can make a huge difference in the market. Once you get out into Louisa and Buckingham and places like that, those areas get much bigger. But those areas are definitely performing slower and more stable than we've seen them in a long time.
So I plugged in our zip code into Altos 22963. So that's Lake Monticello, Palmyra, that kind of area. It's right smack at about 50. So it's in the strong sellers market on that end of it. So there's certain individual markets that's just going to be performing well from a seller's perspective.
Well, the lake's always been strong. I mean, even when we were in the bad times back in 08 and 09 and 10, there was still a lot of activity out there. It's just not affordable for most folks anymore. I mean, what's the median price in Lake Monticello is well outside of the range of most first-time home buyers.
Yeah, I didn't run it. I'll share it later. I ran the first 8 months for this year early this morning. But about 350, 360 in that price range.
Jay Dominic, you jump in here anywhere you want to go. Miko Los Pedros giving Woody Fincham the props, the best of the best from Miklo.
Thanks, Aaron.
Jay, he's watching New Mexico. Jay, the show is yours. Anywhere you want to go on this.
I just want to mention one thing about the interest rates, because there's always talk about that, and I just want to say that there's a prediction out there that say this fall that the rates should be in the mid fives.
That's bananas to me.
Well, except that prediction was from January of 2023. Okay, So the point being is, be careful who you listen to as predictions. Last year, at the beginning of the year, they were saying rates are going to be in mid-fives. Nobody predicted the pandemic and the rates plumbing there. When they thought the rates were going to come down, they went up, hovering near 8. Okay?
That was October 2023.
Right.
So
That was the most unaffordable time in American history to buy a house,
And the
October of
prediction-
last year.
And the prediction at the beginning of the year was that the rates were going to be in mid-fives by then.
This same week last year, I had Dr. Yoon predict at the CEO event that we were going to be in the fives.
Okay, so why don't we, instead of
But
doing,
let me get
Yeah.
this out real quick. Do you think the current rate environment already has baked in the Powell's?
I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah.
So I'll just touch on that briefly, okay?
I agree.
The day that the Fed drops the interest rates a quarter point, will the mortgage interest rates drop a 0.25%?
No.
No. It's just as likely they'll go up that day. Maybe slightly more likely they go up that day. Because the Fed doesn't control the mortgage interest rates. The Fed controls the shortest of the shortest term interest rates. The Fed controls what interest rates banks charge each other for overnight lending. Okay? What drives the interest rates are the pricing on mortgage-backed securities.
Which is
Okay? And that's a
basically-
whole different market.
It is, yeah.
So when you see a report that came out that says, okay, unemployment is down, producer price index is up, these are inflationary things, the market reacts to it. And the inverse is true as well. So when the Fed is talking about cutting interest rates, the same mechanism that causes the Fed to think we want to cut interest rates is the same thing, lack of inflation, that drives the mortgage interest rates lower.
okay, well explained, very well explained. After this election and we get into the first and second quarter of next year, what is your hunch? You've been in this game for how long?
I'm right on Keith's timeline. Since
almost-
1987, 37 years.
Okay, 37 years he's been doing this.
Right.
So this guy's a pro's pro here. Next year, first 30, call it 90 days of next year. That's not that far of a prediction from now. Where do you think we're going to be?
I think in the spring of next year, if I was going to bet my money at the blackjack table here, I would say that I would be thinking the rates are going to be conventional rates. When I'm talking about these average rates, not the anomalies out there, but I think that we'll be in the upper fives.
Yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah.
Then you're right. We got to be right then.
Yeah.
If you and I agree-
No. I
So
think.
let's look at this thing from a historical data. So I'm looking at from Freddie Mac, mortgage rate decreased lending up to 8 out of the last 11 presidential elections. 1980 went up 2%. I remember that. 84 down 1%. 88 down 0.16, stayed kind of flat. 92 went up 0.16. 96 went down 0.63. 2000 down 0.40. 2004 0.33 down. 08 0.3 down. 12 0.20 down. 16 went up 0.3, and 20 went down 0.25. So historically, after elections, interest rates typically drop. So you're going to see that happen. And to your point, that's got nothing to do with the Fed. That this is just the way the mortgage-backed securities.
The conspiracy theorist in me is a bit.
Fed's lowering interest rates
Yeah.
to help to help a certain
Administration. Yeah.
Here's my take on it.
Yeah.
I don't think the Fed really gives a crap.
Okay. Let's go down that.
Well, they're not
Everything they've done or talked about has
Been based on data.
based on data.
Yeah.
I think it's purely data driven. Now, I'm sure they have their own political leanings, but I've not seen anything. If the Fed wanted X candidate to win, they would have, and they thought
Done it
they'd do
already.
they would have done it already.
They would have done it. Okay. But the timing is curious from a perception standpoint.
But not from a data standpoint.
Fair. That's a great counterpoint. I'll throw this to you. If your prediction is right, and I trust you. You've been in this 40. If your prediction is right, and we're in a high fives or mid fives rate environment on conventional, not the anomaly stuff, by spring of next year, what does that do to market dynamics in Central Virginia? All I care about is Central Virginia.
I think Keith is right that more buyers will come into play. I've got buyers that have dropped off the charts because of the interest rate increases. I do think that when the rates get into the upper fives, that some of these people that are sitting at the 3.5 or something like that and thinking, well, we'd like to sell, but we're not going to sell and try to find a house at 7. I think some of those people are going to bite the bullet.
I agree.
I think there is going to be some more market. I don't think it's going to be a flood.
80%, whatever it's way north of 50% of sellers are doing it for life changes, right? Divorces, marriages, getting old, right?
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. Jump in here, Woody. What do you think?
I'm just wowed by 1987. I was still playing with G.I. Joes in 1987.
Well, so were we, but that's a different thing altogether.
Hold it. I'm not supposed to be doing
Dominic,
that now.
that was effing funny.
I don't think that
I was
it's
playing
going
with
to do
Barbies, but-
buyers any favors for the rates to drop because competition's still fierce, and I don't believe it's going to be any less fierce in the spring unless a major economic happening.
So let
occurs.
me try the question a different way. Let's assume magically end of the first quarter at 5.5, just to pick a number, right? Do you think we're going back to the insanity of 2001 with just crazy offers, or has the buyers gotten smarter, right, and will be make intelligent decisions about what they're doing, not just buying something to buy something? Does that make sense?
It's
that
hard to
question?
call because you guys are talking about the Fed, and the Fed, I love
No,
Jay's
I'm talking
explanation.
about mortgage rates going
No,
down.
yeah, but where I'm getting at is that the zeitgeist matters with this stuff, and the reason the news is hyperbolic about the Fed rate is because they make the consumer think that it does drive the mortgage rate. It's misinformation that's put out there,
Right.
And need people like you and me and you to help straighten people out on that. If the zeitgeist at whatever time, and you're going back to your conspiracy theory here, I mean, whatever's going on politically at the time too matters. So whatever hyperbole gets out there, and the media picks up and carries, it will matter a lot. So trying to guess what a buyer is going to want to do in the spring is really difficult to say because it's really going to matter how the winds are blowing at that point.
So, Judah, if you can put up slide number 3 and leave it up there for a little while. So to that point, so I've been tracking since 2016 the total number of sales and median sales price, right? So this is the full car footprint. It's all product types, new construction, condos, attached, detached. We are now at 2,054 transactions. These are closed transactions from January 1 up until literally this morning. We are roughly 400 a little over 400 transactions below where we were in 2016. So we are producing or selling less homes than we were in 2016. But take a look at that 480. I didn't do the percentage difference between 275 and 480, but it's probably north of 80%, I would imagine. Or
This is
awfully close.
great data.
Pretty close to 80%. So sales volumes are dropping, right? In other words, the number of actual transactions. I think you're going, and we predicted this last month, the month before that. I still think you're going to see that number decrease through the balance of this year.
Units sold.
Units sold.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with you.
But you're also going to see buyers have a little bit more control in the market, right? Which is weird. That doesn't kind of equate, right? So if I got more buyers and less units on the market, you would think that the sellers would have a little bit more control, but you're starting to see this out in the field. That's why this needle is changing on Altos, that, some buyers are starting to assert control over the process. I think that's going to increase.
Jamie Turner has a question for the panel. What drives the mispricing leading to so many price adjustments happening in the area? Do the realtors not have the tools to accurately price? I think I can answer this. I think the realtors have the tools to accurately price. What's driving the mispricing is disillusionment with the sellers.
Yes.
So
Because the sellers still think this is a market that was synonymous during COVID and the pandemic, and it's not.
Right.
It's not that market anymore.
So put up slide number 3 again, if you don't mind. Pandemic was 21. We had 3,190 transactions happen the first 8 months. We're now roughly, round numbers, almost 1,000 transactions down since 2021. I'm going to get myself into trouble again, second time. Maybe more than the second time.
I love when you lead with that to just further draw attention to the trouble that you're doing.
Yeah, well,
No offense.
It's
but-
like, I'm going to steal a cookie from the cookie
You're going to be
jar.
offended here in a second.
Right.
no offense, but it's a New York thing. when you have these volume of sales at this much and you have 1,000+ agents in the marketplace, getting the listing is king, and they'll just take listings to take listings, right? And not sit down and say, okay.
It's just terrible business. It's bad business.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you.
It's going to cause some problems for some folks in that realm, because if you overpromise and underdeliver, you're not going to remain a popular professional.
And the listing agent is going out of pocket anywhere from $500 to $1,500 photography and videography alone.
It could be more than that, depending on the
Yeah,
listing.
plus their time. Not only is it bad business, it's actually costing them money.
Yeah. Well, that's back in the bad business category. But, getting it right and convincing your client this is the right number takes a lot of guts, frankly. And, if Michael Guthrie is watching, I need to give him credit, because I stole this terminology. I'd rather disappoint you now than later. It's straight Michael Guthrie, and he's 100% right. I'd rather disappoint you now and give you a right number than get into the project or get into the listing and disappoint you. And once it starts decreasing, the inventory is so light, when your price gets dropping, what's the first thing the buyer's going to ask? What the hell's wrong?
Yeah.
Right? So get the number right. Price matters. Location's number one, price is number two of my 6 rights. And price matters. And if you have any concern about that, you hire this man, Woody, instead of paying the photography, pay this man a fee to go give you a number, and he'll tell you what the market value is maybe not to the penny, but pretty damn close to the penny.
This question's come in the feed. The cash buyers in the market, what percentage of transactions are cash buyers?
Oh, wow, great
We're
question.
still north of 30%, aren't we?
I think we're more than that. I can tell you real quickly when
30%
somebody
plus
answers
is
that question.
astronomical.
Going back to what
It's
Keith's
crazy.
talking about, though, with pre-listing appraisals, I can't tell you how often I get a call from one of my realtor colleagues, and they're like, "Hey, I've got this situation. Can you come in and do a pre-list for us?" And we will, and we end up a lot of times telling the consumer or the seller the exact same thing that the agent's already told them, but for whatever reason, it doesn't sit well with the consumer, because they are being very overzealous on how they want to price it, and they're using all the information they get from the news and what have you, and they go, "Well, we think it's worth $1 million." And it's not, and I'm glad that we can come in and help folks doing that, but it's just, I can't, probably 80% of the time we end up at the same range of number that the agent had already told them.
So last 7 days, 66 transactions happened in the car footprint. I'm just looking at my little market snapshot that I have set up on Paragon. 22 of those 66 were cash transactions.
It's 30%, 33%.
Yeah, 28 was conventional fixed, and there was 7 FHA, 1 rural, and 7 VA on that end of it.
This question for Jay, what's the good rule of thumb for refinancing on interest rate, save, points-wise, and the cost for a refinance rule of thumb? It's a good question. You get that all the time.
My standard response is I hate rules of thumb. But I'll say this: if one of my clients, past borrowers, call me up and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about refinance," my response is, "Well, you're at 6.5, and you need to be this rate to get there." The question is always, if I refinanced and I pay these closing costs, how much will I save per month? Okay, how long will it take for me to recoup that money? If the answer is inside of 3 years, then okay. Preferably less, but it's not I have to be 2% below. Heck, if I've got an $800,000 mortgage, 3/4% might do it.
It's massive.
But if I'm at $200,000 or $150,000 mortgage amount, 2% is probably not enough to cover all those closing costs, to recoup those costs.
And you also have to look at, and Jay obviously knows this in the counsel he provides, it's not just how quickly can you recoup the closing costs, it's what it does for the monthly budget. Because if you're saving hundreds of dollars, if you have a loan of that magnitude and you're saving hundreds of dollars, that could just offer relief of getting day-to-day, past bills.
Yeah, cash flow is important.
That's what it is.
Budgets, or it could be a strategy of what I like to do is not just say, "Hey, guess what? You save $220 a month." I'd say, "How about you take the savings? You're already laying this out. How about put it towards your credit card or something like that?"
There you go.
So
You shouldn't be paying extra on your mortgage if you've got a bunch of credit card debt.
Oh, yeah.
Back to the cash question, while you guys were chatting, I just took a look at what closed in Albemarle County. Just Albemarle County, from the first of the year to today, there was 1,100 transactions that closed. 400 of them were cash. So it's approaching almost 40%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would expect Albemarle to be
Yeah.
higher than a lot of the other
That's in Albemarle
counties.
County.
Yeah.
Can we use that data to suggest or to infer that those people doing the cash transactions are new to the area? That have sold elsewhere and have moved to the area?
The only real way to do that is just to take a dive into all 1,000 or all 400 and make some phone calls to agents and get back, which would be a lot of
That's a lot of work.
A lot of phone calls.
This is a follow-up. Is the closing costs, I know you hate rule of thumbs, but around a point?
No.
What are we talking?
There'd probably be more, but I wouldn't say, let me say this. If somebody's buying a house, there's a rule of thumb out there that say we'll use 3% of the sale price closing costs. 3% is too little at certain price ranges, too much at other price ranges. So I would probably say that the closing costs
And a refi.
on a refi
Yeah.
are going to be not 3%. It's going to be less, but you're going through all the same closing costs you did when you bought the house, except for some tax stamps for purchase.
So that's why who's on the other side matters, to kind of round up this conversation back to that end of it. Because if I got a buyer and that buyer's talking to Jay, we're all going to have this conversation about what the projected closing cost might be for this specific property. Because if we're trying to negotiate seller concessions, we got to know what that number is, right? On that end of it. So who's on the other side matters. Having these conversations matter. I know everybody wants to text and do all this fun stuff, but you actually have to have this one-on-one conversation. Back on the cash thing, there was 296 transactions in the city of Charlottesville. 116 of them were cash. So that is approaching 50% in the mid
That's
to high
significant.
40s.
Well, your demographics matter in both Albemarle and Charlottesville. I mean, you've got a lot more folks with
Deep
means.
pockets.
Yeah. A question for Jay real quick. I know we're getting close to time, but
think we're
there's
over
been some scuttlebutt on a 40-year mortgage becoming a thing.
Oh, God.
Well, I hear all sorts of things about potential loan products, stuff like that. Yeah, I don't see it being relative. I mean, 40-year mortgages were out a while ago.
Sure.
But the price of them were high. It was not a good product. For all the more you saved, it was partially offset by the higher interest rate. It wasn't a whole lot different than interest only. So
Well, the amount that you actually end up paying back on your loan over 40 years versus 30 years is significant.
it's significant on a 30-year, and
Yeah.
it gets
Oh,
even
sure.
worse
Oh,
at,
sure.
at a 40. So if that comes into play, I don't see that as a big player. It's not going to be priced very well because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they aren't going to be buying these things. So I don't see that as
I
going to
just
be a
can't
big
believe we're having
factor.
a conversation about a 40-year mortgage.
How about the 7 or longer car term? Buy a car, finance it over 7 or 8 years.
Right. I see some crazy car
Drive it
payments
off the
out
lot.
there.
It depreciates 40%. Then you're going to
Yeah.
pay interest over 7 years.
Except housing doesn't depreciate.
Let's have
Fulvana County, back to the cash question, to your point, 257 transactions, 52 were cash. So the city of Charlottesville was 296, a little bit higher, but almost double the cash transactions in the city of Charlottesville versus Fulvana, and that's purely based on price point. Gentlemen, we are way beyond
Yeah.
our time.
Keith Smith, Woody Fincham, and Jay Dominic. Woody, close with some final thoughts for the viewers and listeners.
Just happy to be back on the show and hang out with my friends. This is always a great conversation to have. And to all my real estate colleagues out there in Charlottesville and around, call, text, email. If we can help you, let us know.
Same for you, Jay Dominic. Some closing thoughts.
Yeah, you can, if you want to have a conversation, have questions, need help with something, you can Google me, Jay Dominic, Town Mortgage. Easy enough to find. I'm all over the internet. But I'm happy to help out anybody, whether it turns into a loan or not.
So I can speak from personal experience, just help navigate a good project. So thank you for your help on that, Jay, getting us
Thank
across
you.
the finish line.
Keith Smith, Woody Fincham, Jay Dominic. Real Talk with Keith Smith online, realtalkwithkeithsmith.com. Click the Partners tab, and you will see the trusted people that you can count on to get through the closing process. Keith Smith.
Yeah, next Friday I am up speaking at the Reese CEO, RES Media CEO event. So Dave Norris is going to be sitting in my spot.
Very
and
nice.
I gave him dealer's choice, so we'll find out who he's going to bring with him.
There you go. Dave Norris next Friday on Real Talk with Keith Smith. Judah Wickower behind the camera. Thank you kindly for joining us. The I Love Seville show at 12:30. So long, everybody.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Nice, John.